The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and Dorothy Bailey's hands would not stop shaking. She had read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe the words were real. 3 full pages, front and back, written in a firm and deliberate hand that she recognized immediately, even though she had never expected to see it again. The paper was good quality, not the cheap kind that dissolved at the edges when the desert wind caught it, and the ink was dark and sure, every letter pressed with the confidence of a man who meant exactly what he said. She sat at the small table in her rented room above the seamstress shop in Abilene, Kansas, on the 22nd of September, 1876, and she read those 3 pages until she had memorized every word, every punctuation mark, every place where the pen had paused and the ink had pooled into a dark dot before the writer had gathered himself and continued. Edwin Underwood had written back. Edwin Underwood, who had every reason in the world to despise her. Edwin Underwood, whose name had become synonymous in her mind with the word betrayal, not because he had betrayed her, but because she had betrayed him, and the shame of it had followed her from Kansas City to St. Louis and back again until she had ended up here, in this small and dusty town, working as a seamstress's assistant, and telling herself every morning that the past was dead and buried, and that she did not deserve a second chance. She had written to him 6 weeks ago on an impulse she still did not fully understand. She had found his address through a mutual acquaintance, a rancher named Clarence Fitch who owed her a small favor, and had parted with Edwin's whereabouts in exchange for mending 3 of his work shirts. She had written the letter late at night, sitting exactly where she sat now, and she had mailed it before she could change her mind, and then she had spent 6 weeks convincing herself it was a mistake. She had told herself that Edwin Underwood would not answer. Edwin Underwood, with his dark eyes and his reputation as the most unforgiving man in 3 counties, would read her letter and toss it into the fire without ceremony. She had been so certain of this that she had stopped listening for the mail carrier's footstep on the stairs. And yet here it was, 3 pages. Her heart was not simply racing. It was doing something more complicated than racing, something she could not name, something that sat between terror and the most dangerous, forbidden thing she had felt in 2 years, which was hope. She read the last paragraph for the 4th time. "I do not write this easily, Dorothy. There are things I have not said to another living soul, but I find I cannot leave them unsaid to you. If you are willing to come, I would ask that you come soon. The winter here is not kind to delayed decisions. I will not pretend I have forgiven everything, but I am asking you to come. The train runs through Dodge City on Fridays. I will be at the station. I will wait. If you do not come, I will understand and I will not write again. But if you come, I believe we might have something worth salvaging." Dorothy set the letter down on the table. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the brown and ordinary street below, where a mule was standing unattended outside the general store, and 2 women in dark dresses were talking in a manner that suggested something scandalous had happened recently. She walked back to the table and picked the letter up again. Then she went to her small trunk in the corner of the room and began to pack. To understand why Edwin Underwood was the last man she had expected to write back, you had to understand Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1874. You had to understand a town that was barely a town, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a water source that had the audacity to call itself a river, surrounded by flat and relentless land that made a person feel both exposed and completely alone at the same time. And you had to understand what it meant to arrive in such a place at the age of 23 with nothing but a carpetbag and a lie. Dorothy Bailey had not come to Millhaven, Texas, because she wanted to. She had come because she was out of options, and because her cousin Harriet, who was married to a cattle buyer, had written her a letter that contained the following sentence, underlined twice. "There is a man here who has advertised for a wife, and he is well established, and I think you might suit each other." The advertisement had been in a Kansas City newspaper under a column titled Matrimonial Correspondence, and it had said, "Respectable cattle rancher, 31 years, widower, seeks honest and capable woman for the purpose of marriage. Millhaven, Texas. Inquiries to E. Underwood." Dorothy had been living in Kansas City in a condition she could only describe as desperate. She had worked at her uncle's millinery shop for 3 years, and when her uncle had died and left the shop to his son, the cousin had made it clear that Dorothy's position was no longer secure. She had $52 saved, which was enough to travel but not enough to rebuild. She had no suitors, or rather she had one, a man named Gerald Pratt who worked at the bank and who had made it clear his interest was conditional on Dorothy's improving her social circumstances, which was the cruelest kind of interest a man could show a woman. She had answered the advertisement. She had corresponded with Edwin Underwood for 4 months, a careful and measured exchange of letters in which both of them were truthful about some things and evasive about others. Edwin had told her about his ranch, which was called the Copperhead on account of a snake encountered during its founding, a name Dorothy had privately found ominous but had not mentioned. He had told her about losing his wife, Caroline, to a fever 2 years prior. He had told her about his 2 ranch hands, a young Mexican man named Tomás and an older Texan named Rudd, and about the nearest town being 14 miles away, and about the fact that the work was hard and the summers were brutal, and he was not a man who spoke his feelings easily. Dorothy had told him she was capable and honest and adaptable. She had told him she was a good cook and a competent seamstress. She had told him she was 23 and in good health. She had told him her family was from Missouri. She had not told him about Gerald Pratt. This was the thing that would become the hidden motive she had carried into that correspondence, the dark past she had concealed in the neat language of her letters. Gerald Pratt was not simply a suitor. Gerald Pratt was a man who had lent her uncle $300 against the shop, and when the uncle died and the shop passed to the cousin who immediately ran it into the ground, Gerald Pratt had come to Dorothy with a certain kind of suggestion. He would forgive the debt, which was technically not hers but which he had implied could become her problem through enough legal maneuvering, if she would agree to marry him on his terms, which were not the terms a respectable man offered a respectable woman. Dorothy had refused, but she had also been frightened, and she had answered Edwin Underwood's advertisement while she was frightened, and she had traveled to Millhaven, Texas, while the fear was still driving her decisions. And when she had stepped off the wagon that served as the local transport from Dodge City and seen Edwin Underwood for the first time, standing in front of the livery with his hat in his hands and his expression careful and neutral, she had thought, "I am here for the wrong reasons, and this is going to hurt someone." She had told herself it would be fine. People married for practical reasons all the time. It was not unusual. It was not, she had told herself, exactly a lie. But Edwin Underwood had not been what she had expected. She had expected a rough and weathered man who wanted a housekeeper with the legal benefits of a wife. She had expected a man whose first wife had softened him into grief, and whose grief had hardened him into someone who would not ask too many questions. What she had found instead was a man who asked very precise questions, who listened to the answers with complete attention, who had read every one of her letters so carefully that he could quote phrases back to her in conversation. He had a mind like a trap, not in the dangerous sense, but in the sense that nothing escaped it. He noticed things. He remembered things, and he was, she had discovered over the 10 days she spent at the Copperhead before she did what she did, a genuinely good man, not sentimental, not easy, but good in the way that mattered, in the way that meant he treated Tomás and old Rudd with the same directness and respect he showed to anyone else, in the way that meant when one of his horses broke a leg and had to be put down, he went into the barn alone afterward and did not come out for an hour, and no one said anything about it. Good in the way that meant when Dorothy woke at dawn her first morning there and came downstairs to find him already at the kitchen table with his account books, he had looked up and said, "Coffee is on the stove. Cups are on the second shelf, and you do not have to do anything today if you are tired from the journey, and meant it. She had begun to feel the trap then, not his trap, her own. She had come for the wrong reasons. She was starting to want to stay for the right ones, and those two things were on a collision course that she could see coming with absolute clarity. The collision had come on the 10th day. She had received a letter from her cousin Harriet, forwarded from Kansas City, which contained news she had not anticipated. Gerald Pratt had apparently told several people in Kansas City that Dorothy Bailey had agreed to marry him before she left, and that her departure was merely a visit to family, and that she would be returning. He had told this to people who would tell other people. He had told it to people who knew people in Millhaven. Harriet had written to warn her, had written with that particular breathless urgency that characterized all of Harriet's correspondence, and the warning had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Dorothy was in the kitchen making bread and Edwin was in town for supplies. She had panicked. That was the only honest word for it. She had panicked in a way that bypassed her better judgment entirely. She had thought, if this gets back to Edwin before I can explain it myself, he will think I was running from something, and he will think the thing I was running from was Gerald Pratt, and he will ask why I didn't mention Gerald Pratt in any of my letters, and then he will have to conclude that I concealed it deliberately, and then she had made the worst decision of her life. She had left. She had packed her carpetbag while Edwin was still in town, and she had walked the 14 miles to Millhaven, and she had taken the next available transport toward Dodge City, and she had not left a note because she had not known what the note would say. She had told herself she would write and explain when she was somewhere safe. She had told herself that Edwin would be relieved, that he would realize she had saved them both from a situation built on incomplete honesty. She had told herself a great many things over the 2 years that followed, in Kansas City and St. Louis and finally Abilene, and none of them had held up under examination. The truth was that she had been a coward. She had seen something real and she had run from it, and she had left a good man standing in a kitchen in Texas with 10 days' worth of reason to trust her and a lifetime's worth of reason to feel betrayed. She had written to him 6 weeks ago because the guilt had become something she could not continue to carry alone. She had written not to ask for anything, but because she owed him an explanation and she could not give it to him in person, and a letter had seemed like the only coward's courage available to her. She had not expected 3 pages in return. She had not expected "I will wait." The train from Abilene to Dodge City ran on Thursdays and Fridays. Today was Thursday. If she went to the station now, if she could get her trunk downstairs and settle her account with Mrs. Fenwick, who ran the seamstress shop, if the train was running on schedule, she could be in Dodge City by Friday evening. She knew from Edwin's letter that the ranch was a full day's ride south of Dodge City, and that he was proposing to meet her at the station. She looked at her half-packed trunk. She looked at the letter on the table. She made a decision that felt less like courage and more like the only honest thing left available to her. She finished packing. Mrs. Fenwick, who was 63 and had seen most varieties of human drama in her 6 decades, took one look at Dorothy's face when she came downstairs with her trunk and said, "Is it a man?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "Is he worth it?" Dorothy thought about 3 pages of deliberate, careful handwriting. She thought about a man who had said he would wait and meant it, because she had learned in 10 days that Edwin Underwood was constitutionally incapable of saying things he did not mean. "I believe so," she said. Mrs. Fenwick helped her carry the trunk to the street, and then, in a gesture that surprised Dorothy enormously, pressed $2 into her hand. "For the fare," she said, "and do not argue with me, child. Life is too short for running from the things worth having." Dorothy did not argue. The train station in Abilene in 1876 was a modest affair, a wooden platform and a small building that housed the ticket office, and a bench that was never quite long enough. Dorothy arrived with 30 minutes to spare and bought her ticket with the last of her own money combined with Mrs. Fenwick's $2, which together came to just enough. She sat on the bench with her trunk beside her, and the letter folded inside her coat, against her heart, which she knew was sentimental. But she had decided that she had been practical for long enough, and that sentiment was not, in fact, the enemy of good sense. The train arrived 12 minutes late, which was considered on time for this particular line. It was a Kansas Pacific locomotive, black and enormous, filling the station with noise and steam, and the particular smell of coal and metal that Dorothy had always found both exciting and slightly frightening. She watched it come to a stop with the focused attention of a woman who is trying to think about practical things, because if she thinks about impractical things, she will lose her nerve. She boarded. She found a seat by a window. She watched Abilene slide past her as the train gathered speed, the brown buildings and the dusty street and the unattended mule outside the general store, and she thought, "This is either the bravest thing I have ever done or the most foolish." She could not yet determine which. The journey to Dodge City took most of Thursday night and part of Friday morning. Dorothy slept in brief intervals, waking each time the train stopped at some small settlement whose name she did not catch. And each time she woke, she was aware of the letter against her chest, and the specific quality of anxiety that comes from traveling towards something you want very badly and are not certain you deserve. The other passengers in her car were a family with 3 children who slept heavily, a cattle buyer who smelled of whiskey and kept to himself, and an older woman in a gray dress who introduced herself as Martha Holcomb and who was traveling to visit her daughter in Dodge City, and who talked for the first hour of the journey about her daughter's husband's cattle operation before falling asleep mid-sentence and not waking until they arrived. Dorothy used the quiet to read Edwin's letter again. He had begun with an acknowledgement that he had received her letter and had needed time to decide how to respond to it, which she understood to mean he had needed to decide whether to respond at all. He had written, "I am not a man who makes decisions impulsively, and so I will tell you that I have considered this letter carefully, and that what I am going to say has been examined from every angle I can manage." This was so entirely characteristic of the Edwin Underwood she had known for 10 days that it made her chest hurt with something complicated. He had then, with the directness that she recognized as his most consistent trait, told her what those 10 days had been like from his perspective. He had come home from town and found the kitchen empty and her room empty and her carpetbag gone, and he had stood in the kitchen for a long time trying to understand what had happened. He had thought at first there was an emergency, a family illness or something of that nature. He had waited 2 days for a letter or a message and none had come. He had asked Harriet, the mutual connection through whom Dorothy had found him, but Harriet had not known where Dorothy was. He had eventually concluded, after 2 weeks, that she had simply changed her mind, and he had decided that the most dignified thing he could do was accept this and move forward. He had written, "I will not say it was without effect. I will not insult either of us by pretending the circumstances were easy to set aside. But I am a man who has survived hard things, and I do not intend to elaborate on what I mean by that except to say that I have learned the difference between what is worth my energy and what is not." The next section of the letter was the one Dorothy had read most carefully, because it contained the thing she had not expected, the thing that had made her hands shake when she first encountered it. Edwin had written, "I did not write back immediately when your letter arrived. I left it on my table for 3 weeks. I want you to know this because I think honesty requires that you understand it was not an easy decision. But I have been sitting with it long enough, and there are things I want to say to you that I have not said to anyone. I have not said them because I am not a man who speaks feelings easily, as I told you from the beginning, but I find I would rather say them awkwardly than not say them at all." What followed was the most vulnerable thing Dorothy had ever read from a man who had presented himself to the world as someone who did not do vulnerability. He had told her that the 10 days she had spent at the Copperhead had not been ordinary. He had told her that he had noticed things about her that he had not noticed about anyone since Caroline, and that this had surprised him, and that he had not known what to do with the surprise. He had told her that when she left, the thing that hurt was not simply the abandonment, but the specific loss of something he had not realized he was hoping for until it was gone. He had written, "I am not writing this to make you feel guilty. You have apparently managed that on your own, judging by your letter, and I have no desire to add to a burden that already seems heavy enough. I am writing this because I think you deserve to know that what you came looking for, whatever it was, I do not believe it was wrong of you to look for it, and I think you deserve to know that I have not been indifferent." Then had come the final paragraph, the one about the train running through Dodge City on Fridays, the one that had sent her to the window and then to her trunk and then to the station. The train pulled into Dodge City on a Friday morning, the 24th of September, 1876, at approximately 9:15. Dodge City at this particular moment in its history was at the height of its cattle trade era, a fact that was immediately apparent from the noise and the smell, and the sheer concentration of men in various states of trail dust, moving along Front Street in both directions. The famous Long Branch Saloon was already doing business at this hour, which struck Dorothy as optimistic, and the streets were churned to a particular consistency by the combination of horse traffic and recent rain that told you exactly what kind of town this was. Dorothy stood on the platform with her trunk and looked for Edwin Underwood. She had almost convinced herself he would not be there. Not because he was not a man of his word, but because 6 weeks was a long time for a man's certainty to hold, and she had not written back to confirm she was coming, because his letter had arrived only yesterday and there had not been time. He was there. He was standing at the far end of the platform, outside the station building, with his hat on and his expression doing that thing it had always done, the thing that looked like neutrality from a distance but was, she had learned in those 10 days, actually the face of a man who felt things very intensely and had trained himself not to show it prematurely. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply forgotten the specific quality of his presence, the way he occupied space without demanding it. He was 33 now. He had always looked like a man who had done more living than his years quite accounted for, and 2 more years had not changed that, had perhaps deepened it. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved for approximately 3 seconds, which was long enough to feel significant. Then Dorothy picked up the handle of her trunk and walked toward him, and Edwin Underwood came off the wall he had been leaning against and met her halfway along the platform, and they stood 2 feet apart in the noise and movement of Dodge City's Friday morning and looked at each other. "You came," he said. "You wrote 3 pages," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the intention of one. "I had things to say." "So did I," Dorothy said. "I should have said them 2 years ago." "I am sorry, Edwin. I am deeply and genuinely sorry, and I know that saying so does not undo the thing I did, but I want you to know that I understand what I did, and I understand why it was wrong, and I am not going to insult you by making excuses for it." Edwin looked at her for a long moment. The noise of the station moved around them, a conductor calling something, a horse somewhere nearby making its opinion of something known, the general din of a cattle town on a Friday. "I read your letter 4 times, he said. "I read yours 4 times as well, she said. "Then we are even on that count," he said. He reached down and took the handle of her trunk. "There is a decent hotel on the south end of Front Street. The proprietress is respectable and it is not adjacent to any of the establishments that would make a decent woman uncomfortable. I thought you might need a day to rest before the ride south." "You thought I was coming," Dorothy said, and she could not keep the note of something complicated out of her voice. "I hoped you were coming," Edwin corrected. "There is a difference. I have been hoping for 6 weeks, which is not a condition I am comfortable with, but there it is." He started walking toward the station exit, carrying her trunk as though it weighed nothing, which told her the ranch work had not made him any less capable than he had been. "Are you hungry? The hotel does a reasonable breakfast." "I am," she said, and fell into step beside him. "Edwin," he stopped and looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for writing back, for being here." He studied her face for a moment with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Then he said, "You were worth writing back to." I had to decide whether to say so. He turned and continued walking. "Come on. The eggs do not improve with waiting." The hotel was called the Dodge House, and it was, as Edwin had described, clean and respectable, operated by a woman named Mrs. Eloise Garrett, who looked at Dorothy and Edwin together with the particular expression of a woman who has seen most of what life has to offer and is mildly interested in this specific iteration of it. She assigned Dorothy a room on the second floor and told her breakfast was still available until 10. They sat across from each other at a small table in the dining room, and for the first few minutes Dorothy focused on her eggs and biscuits, and Edwin focused on his coffee, and the silence between them was not entirely comfortable, but it was the kind of discomfort that comes from things being real rather than from things being wrong. "Tell me about the past 2 years," Edwin said finally. "Kansas City, then St. Louis, then Abilene," Dorothy said. "Seamstress work mostly. I am better at it than I thought I would be." "And Gerald Pratt," Dorothy looked up. She had mentioned Gerald Pratt in her letter, had made herself include the whole explanation, the loan and the pressure and the fear that had been driving her when she answered his advertisement. She had braced herself for this question. "He found a different woman to bother within 6 months," she said. "I have had no contact with him since I left Kansas City the first time." Edwin nodded slowly. "And the debt he claimed you owed was never legally mine," Dorothy said. "I consulted a lawyer in St. Louis, a proper one, and he confirmed it. Gerald Pratt had no legal claim on me. He was using the threat because he thought I did not know better." "But you knew better by the time you came to Texas," Edwin said. His voice was not accusatory. It was observational, the voice of a man following a logic. "I knew better by the time I was halfway to Texas," Dorothy said. "But I had already answered your advertisement, and I had been corresponding with you for 4 months, and by then," she stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. "By then I wanted to come, not because I was running from Gerald Pratt. That had stopped being the reason somewhere around the 2nd month of our correspondence. I wanted to come because of your letters and because of what I thought I might find, and that frightened me more than Gerald Pratt ever had, if I am being entirely honest." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "Because wanting something real carries more risk than wanting escape," he said. "Yes," Dorothy said. She looked at him. "Exactly that." He looked back at her, and the neutrality of his expression shifted in a way she was starting to remember, the way it shifted when something she said had gotten past the careful guard he kept. He looked down at his coffee cup. He looked back up. "I have made some changes at the ranch," he said, which was not the non sequitur it sounded like, because she understood that he was moving them forward deliberately, that he was saying, "We have acknowledged what happened and now we move." The south pasture fence was a constant problem. Tamaz and I rebuilt the whole east section last spring. Rudd left, I should tell you. He went to his daughters in Oklahoma. A younger man came on in his place, a fellow named Casper Malone, who is 25 and enthusiastic beyond his level of current skill but learning. Dorothy felt something in her chest ease at this, at the ordinariness of it, at the way he was offering her information about his life as a form of trust. "And the house," she said, "is it still the same?" "Mostly," Edwin said. "I put in a proper window in the kitchen. The original one let in too much wind." "I remember," Dorothy said. "I remember thinking the kitchen was cold in the mornings." Something crossed his face then, something that was not sadness exactly but lived in the same territory. "I know," he said quietly. "I remember thinking so too." The day in Dodge City was a careful and specific kind of day. The kind that would stay with Dorothy for the rest of her life in the particular detail that days of high significance tend to be preserved in. Edwin showed her around the parts of town that were worth seeing, which were fewer than the parts that were not, and they walked and talked for most of the afternoon with the ease that she had felt in their correspondence, and the additional layer that came from proximity. From the way he spoke with his hands occasionally when he was making a point, and the way he listened to her with his full attention, not the impatient half-attention of someone waiting for his turn to speak. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the past. They talked about the cattle business, which was changing, Edwin said, in ways that were not entirely predictable, with the railheads expanding and the range land contracting and the big operations getting bigger, while the small ones like the Copperhead had to be nimble to survive. They talked about the books they had read, a topic that had appeared in their original correspondence, and that now resumed with the comfort of a conversation interrupted midway. Edwin was working his way through a history of the Civil War that he had ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City, and Dorothy had read, in her time in Abilene, most of the novels available at the lending library, including several she considered brilliant and one she considered the finest thing she had encountered in years. "Which one?" Edwin asked. "Daniel Deronda," Dorothy said, "by George Eliot." "You should know," Edwin said, with the note in his voice that she recognized as his version of amusement, "that I ordered that book 3 months ago, and it has been sitting on my desk because I kept telling myself I would get to it." "Read it," Dorothy said firmly. "Do not tell yourself you will get to it. Read it." "I will," he said. "Now I have additional motivation." She looked at him sideways when he said this, and he met her look with a steadiness that made her heart do the complicated thing again. They had supper at the hotel, and afterward Edwin said he was staying at a boarding house 2 streets over and that he would be at the hotel at 8 the next morning with a wagon for the ride south. He said it with the careful formality of a man who was making sure she understood that he was not assuming anything, that he was offering a situation and leaving the decision of how she entered it entirely to her. Dorothy appreciated this more than she could easily say. She stood in the doorway of the hotel and watched him walk away down Front Street in the fading light, and she thought, "I left this man. I left this specific, precise, infuriatingly decent man, and I spent 2 years convincing myself it was the only thing I could have done, and I was wrong. I was wrong in the way that is almost unforgivable, and he wrote me 3 pages anyway." She went upstairs and slept better than she had in 2 years. The ride south from Dodge City to the Copperhead Ranch took the better part of a day, with Edwin driving the wagon and Dorothy sitting beside him on the bench seat in the early morning chill of a late September prairie. The land opened up around them as they traveled, becoming flatter and more emphatic in its flatness, the sky enormous above it, the grass the color of dried wheat bending in a wind that came from no particular direction and went to all of them simultaneously. They talked for much of the journey, and they were also comfortable being quiet, which Dorothy had always considered the truest measure of compatibility. She had known people who panicked at silence and people who weaponized it, and she had always valued the kind of person who could sit beside you on a wagon bench with 50 miles of prairie around them and not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Edwin was that kind of person. Around midday they stopped at a small creek to water the horses, a matched pair of bays that Edwin drove with the unconscious competence of a man who had been handling horses since he was a boy, and they ate the lunch that the hotel kitchen had packed for them, which was cold biscuits and dried beef and 2 apples, and they sat on the creek bank and Dorothy took off her boots because her feet were cramped from the bench, and the creek water was cold but not unpleasant. "Tell me something," Edwin said. "What kind of something?" "Something you have never told anyone else," he said. He was looking at the creek, not at her. "I told you things in that letter that I have not said to another person. I would like for the exchange to be somewhat equitable." Dorothy considered this. She looked at the water running over the brown stones of the creek bed. She thought about the things she kept private, the things she carried in the locked room of her own internal landscape. "When I was 17, she said, "my father got very sick. He was ill for the better part of a year, and during that year I was responsible for most of what needed to happen in our household. Because my mother was not capable in practical terms, she was capable in other terms, but the practical management fell to me. And I did it. I managed the household accounts and I dealt with the creditors and I made the arrangements. And when my father recovered, he was grateful, but he was also, she paused. He wanted to believe that everything had been fine while he was ill. He wanted to believe the household had run itself, or that someone other than his 17-year-old daughter had managed it. Because acknowledging that I had managed it would have required acknowledging that I was capable of things that women in his understanding were not supposed to be capable of. Edwin was listening. She could feel it. So I let him believe it, she said. I let him thank my aunt who had done very little. I let him construct a version of that year that did not include my actual role in it. And I have never told anyone what that year actually looked like, because telling it would mean telling that my father needed the diminished version of me in order to love me comfortably. She picked up a small stone and turned it over in her hand. And the reason I have never told anyone is that I am not sure whether I made the right choice, she said. I protected him, but I also protected the lie, and sometimes I think they were the same thing, and sometimes I think they were very different things, and I still do not know which is right. Edwin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father was the same kind of man." Dorothy looked at him. "He needed a version of the world that made sense to him," Edwin said, "and things that didn't fit that version he simply didn't see. I loved him, but it meant I spent 30 years being half of what I was around him." He picked up his own stone and threw it into the creek with an easy flick of his wrist. "I decided after he died that I would not do that again, not for anyone. If a person couldn't see what was actually there, I didn't think that was a problem I could solve for them." "Is that why you were direct with me?" Dorothy said. "In your letters from the beginning?" "Yes," he said. "I had been direct in my correspondence with the others." Dorothy paused. "The others. 3 women wrote before you did," he said, without particular self-consciousness. "None of them responded to the second letter. I think the directness was alarming." "It was not alarming," Dorothy said. "It was the reason I wrote back." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That was apparent from your first response." She stared at him. "You could tell that from my first response." "You wrote back within 4 days," he said. "And your response to my question about what you wanted in a life was the only honest answer I had received to that question from anyone. Most people give you the answer they think you want. You gave me a list of things that included, and I remember this specifically, the ability to sit quietly with someone you trust." Dorothy felt warmth move through her chest. She had written that. She had written it and then been slightly embarrassed by it, and then sent the letter before she could edit it out. "And I thought," Edwin continued, his voice carefully level, "that was the most accurate description of what I also wanted that I had encountered." They sat by the creek for another 10 minutes, and then Edwin said they should continue if they wanted to reach the ranch before dark, and they put their boots on and loaded back into the wagon and continued south. The Copperhead Ranch appeared in the late afternoon light as a collection of low buildings against the flat horizon, growing larger as they approached with the slow revelation of details that distance had been withholding. A main house, timber-framed and solid, with the new kitchen window Edwin had mentioned catching the late sun. A barn somewhat larger than the house. 2 smaller outbuildings. A corral where 3 horses were moving in that aimless way horses move when they are not busy. A vegetable garden along the south wall of the house that had been ambitious in the spring and was now winding down toward winter. Tamaz came out of the barn as they pulled up, and he was as Dorothy half remembered him. A lean young man of 24 with a quality of easy capability that Edwin shared, and that she suspected Edwin had recognized in him and valued for that reason. He greeted Edwin with a nod and Dorothy with a more formal courtesy, taking his hat off and putting it back on in a single efficient motion. "The fence in the north pasture held," he told Edwin. And Casper fixed the hinge on the barn door. "Good," Edwin said. He helped Dorothy down from the wagon bench with a brief and businesslike hand, not lingering but not hurrying either, a contact that was simply practical, and yet which Dorothy was aware of in every detail. "Miss Bailey will be staying in the guest room," he said to Tamaz, and then to Dorothy. I will show you." The guest room was small and clean, and had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which Dorothy immediately identified as a kindness, though she was not certain whether it was deliberate or coincidental. There was a quilt on the bed that she recognized as good quality, the kind of thing that took many hours to make, and she wondered if it had been Caroline's and decided that it did not matter and that she would not ask. Edwin set her trunk inside the door and said, "Supper is in 2 hours. You have time to rest. The kitchen is yours if you need water." "Thank you, Edwin," she said. He started to leave and then paused in the doorway. He had his hat in his hand, turning it by the brim, which she had learned in those original 10 days was what his hands did when he was working toward saying something he hadn't decided how to frame yet. "I am glad you came," he said. "I am glad I came as well," she said. He nodded, replaced his hat, and left. Dorothy sat down on the edge of the bed in the fading September light and put her face in her hands and breath for a moment, not because she was upset, but because the feeling in her chest was so specific and so overwhelming that she needed to acknowledge it privately before she could do anything else. The feeling was something like arriving. The feeling was something like, "This is the place I should have stayed." She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and the feeling was not a sad one. It was sharp and clear and very large, and she sat with it for a few minutes, and then she washed her face with the water from the pitcher on the stand, and combed her hair and went to find the kitchen. The first 2 weeks at the Copperhead were a kind of careful dance, the kind that happens between two people who know what they want but are being cautious about the wanting, because the wanting had been disappointed before, and caution is the sensible response to hope that has been hurt. Dorothy cooked and helped with the household tasks because she wanted to, not because Edwin asked her to, and there was a significant difference in this that she understood, and that Edwin appeared to understand as well. He did not treat her as an employee or as a domestic adjunct to the operation of the ranch. He treated her as a person who was present in his life and whose presence he valued, which looked like asking her opinion on the fence repair schedule, telling her what was in the account books when she asked to see them, teaching her to ride properly on a quiet mare named Bess who had a smooth gait and endless patience. The riding lessons were when she first touched him deliberately. She had been trying to post correctly to Bess's trot, which is the rhythmic motion of rising and sitting that follows the horse's diagonal footfall, and she had been doing it badly, which Bess was ignoring with the magnificent indifference of a horse who had seen worse, when Edwin had ridden up alongside her on his big gray gelding, and said without preamble that the problem was her hands. He had ridden close and reached out and adjusted her grip on the reins, and the contact was brief and instructional and entirely appropriate, but Dorothy had been aware of every second of it, and when she looked at his face, she saw that he was also very deliberately focused on her hands and not on her face, which told her everything she needed to know about the current state of things. After the second week, the dance shifted. It shifted because of a Thursday evening when a late September storm came through the prairie with the particular ferocity of prairie storms, which do not announce themselves politely, but simply arrive with full commitment to the enterprise. Dorothy had been reading in the main room and Edwin had come in from checking on the horses, soaked through, and she had handed him a towel from the linen shelf without being asked, and they had ended up sitting across from each other at the table with the storm loud against the windows and the lamp between them, both of them with books they were not reading. "Ask me what you want to ask me," Dorothy said. Edwin looked up from his not reading. "You have been circling something for 3 days," she said. "Whatever it is, ask it. I would rather answer a direct question than keep wondering what you are working up to." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. "Are you planning to stay?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Permanently." "Yes. And the practical arrangement," he said. "You understand what I am asking when I say that. You are asking whether I came here with the intention of marrying you," Dorothy said. "Yes." She looked at him across the lamp and the unread books and the sound of the storm outside. She thought about the careful honesty of his 3-page letter, She thought about a man who had said he would wait and had been at the station. She thought about the way he had adjusted her grip on the reins with focused, deliberate gentleness, and then looked at her hands and not at her face. "I came because you wrote 3 pages," she said, "and because there is nothing in those pages that is not worth coming to. Yes, I came with the intention of staying, and yes, I would like to marry you, if that is still something you want. And if it is not, I would like you to tell me directly, because I am better equipped to handle direct information than I am to handle uncertainty." Edwin was quiet for a moment, in which the storm did something emphatic against the roof. "It is something I want," he said. "Then, I should warn you that I am not easy to live with. I am particular about certain things. I get up very early, and I do not function well when things are disorganized. I can go a whole day without speaking if I am working on something difficult, and I do not mean it as an insult when I do." "I know all of this," Dorothy said. "I knew it inside of 4 days the first time I was here." "And," he said, "and I am still here," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, precise eyes. "Dorothy," he said, in a voice that was different from his ordinary speaking voice, lower and more careful, the voice he used when he was saying something that had been behind the guard for a while. "I did not. When I placed that advertisement, I was doing a practical thing. I had a ranch that needed a certain kind of life in it. I had been managing without that for 2 years, and I was doing it adequately, and I expected to find someone adequate. I did not expect to find someone I could not stop thinking about." He paused. "I have thought about you every day for 2 years." Dorothy's breath caught. "I was angry," he said, "for the first few months. And then I was not angry anymore, just aware that something was missing that I had not known I was looking for. And when your letter arrived, I left it on the table for 3 weeks, as I said, and then I read it in one sitting, and I wrote back the same night." "You wrote 3 pages," Dorothy said softly. "I wrote 5, he said. "I cut 2 of them because they were excessive." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from surprise, and Edwin's expression broke into something she had not seen on his face before, a full and genuine smile that changed his face entirely, that made him look younger and less armored and completely different from the careful, contained man he generally presented to the world. "Edwin," she said, "yes, I have thought about you every day for 2 years also." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but the way you take hold of something you have been concerned about losing and are relieved to find still there. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and it held hers with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and Dorothy thought, "Yes, this is it. This is exactly what I came back for." The storm moved on sometime in the early hours of the morning, leaving the sky scrubbed clean, and the grass silvered with water that would dry by noon. Dorothy lay in her east-facing guest room, and listened to the quiet that comes after storms, and thought about Edwin Underwood holding her hand across a lamplit table and smiling in the way he apparently reserved for moments when she surprised him, and she made no attempt to sleep because she did not want to. They were married 5 weeks later, on the first Saturday of November 1876, by a circuit preacher named Reverend McCabe, who came through the area twice a year, and who had married several couples of his acquaintance and divorced none of them, as he mentioned cheerfully before the ceremony. The wedding was small, necessarily so given the location and the season. Tamaz and Casper were there, and Harriet, Dorothy's cousin, who had driven out from Dodge City with her husband for the occasion, and who cried throughout the ceremony in a way that suggested she felt personally responsible for the entire romance, and was not wrong. Mrs. Garrett from the Dodge House Hotel had somehow heard about it and sent a preserved fruit cake via Harriet, which was received with great appreciation because it was delicious. Dorothy wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself during her time in Abilene, and which was more suited to a Kansas autumn than a wedding, but which fitted her well, and which Edwin looked at for a specific moment when she came out of the house that told her the color was right. Edwin wore his good coat and a white shirt that he had clearly pressed himself, and he stood beside her in front of Reverend McCabe in the thin November sunlight outside the house, and he said the vows with the same deliberate certainty he brought to everything, meaning each word as he said it, which Dorothy had expected and which moved her anyway. When Reverend McCabe said the words about kissing the bride, Edwin looked at her with a question in his dark eyes, asking rather than assuming, and she nodded, and he kissed her with the same quality he had brought to everything since she arrived, careful and entirely meant. Harriet made a sound that could only be described as emotional. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tests everything, which Dorothy later thought was not accidental, that life has a way of stress testing the things worth keeping. It was a brutal winter by any measure, the kind that the old-timers in the area would reference for years afterward, with snowfall in November and temperatures that dropped low enough to be genuinely dangerous, and a stretch in January when they were essentially confined to the house for 8 days by weather that made any outdoor activity life-threatening. 8 days confined to a house with another person is one of the more efficient ways to truly know that person. Dorothy learned things about Edwin during those 8 days that 4 months of letters and 10 original days and 5 subsequent weeks had not fully revealed. She learned that he had a very particular sense of humor, dry and specific, and delivered in the completely level voice he used for ordinary statements, so that you sometimes didn't realize he had made a joke until a moment later, and when you realized it, you laughed with the additional pleasure of the slight delay. She learned that he had read more widely than she had suspected, and that he had opinions about literature that were unconventional and interesting, and arrived in fully formed arguments that were a genuine pleasure to argue against. She learned that he was a better cook than he had let on, and that he had developed this skill out of necessity during his 2 years alone, and considered it a practical matter rather than anything worth mentioning. She also learned, in the private context of a marriage, that the careful and contained Edwin Underwood she had observed in public was, in private, a man of considerable feeling, that the guard he kept was not indifference but the opposite of indifference, a man who felt things so acutely that he had developed the guard as a matter of self-preservation, and that within the safety of their marriage, he let it down with a completeness that humbled her. She told him this during the 5th day of the snowbound week when they were sitting by the fire after supper and the wind was doing its best impression of a biblical judgment against the walls of the house. "I want you to know," she said, "that I see it." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "See what?" "All of it," she said. "What you are, not just what you show." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that alarming?" he said. "No," she said. "It is the opposite of alarming." He set his coffee cup down and looked at the fire for a moment with the expression she had learned to read as him processing something that had gotten past the guard. Then he looked at her and said, "You are the only person I have ever been this." He stopped, tried again. "I was not this with Caroline," he said carefully. "I was fond of Caroline and I grieved her genuinely, but I was not this. I did not know I was capable of this." He met her eyes. "I need you to know that." Dorothy felt something shift permanently inside her, a rearrangement of something fundamental. "I know," she said quietly. "I know, Edwin." "I am going to be terrible at saying it," he said. "I will probably say it with actions most of the time because that is what comes naturally to me. But I do not want you to mistake the actions for something less than what they are." "I will not mistake them," she said. He nodded once, the decisive nod that meant the matter was settled. Then he picked up Daniel Deronda, which he had finally started reading at Dorothy's insistence, and she picked up her own book, and they sat by the fire in the snowbound house in the January cold of 1877, and the silence between them was the exact kind she had written about in her second letter to him, the kind she had always wanted, and which was, in the having of it, even better than the wanting. Spring came to the Copperhead with the particular drama that follows hard winters, the land greening with an urgency that felt almost indignant, as though the grass was making a point. The cattle operation recovered from the winter losses better than Edwin had feared, and by April the ranch was running at the level he considered sustainable, which was not luxurious but was sufficient and trending in the right direction. Dorothy had taken on the account books by this point, not because Edwin had asked, but because she had a facility for numbers that she had demonstrated during the winter, and that Edwin had observed with the expression he wore when something impressed him, which looked to the uninformed eye like ordinary attention, but which Dorothy could now read with precision. He had handed the books over without ceremony, simply set them on her side of the table one morning and said, "Tell me if you see anything I have missed." And when she found a billing error from the feed supplier that had been costing them $3 a month for 8 months, he had looked at her mathematical work and said, "You have a better eye for this than I do," which was high praise from a man who was considerably better at most things than he admitted. In May, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. She told Edwin on a Tuesday evening, which was not a planned disclosure, but she had known for 3 weeks and had been waiting for a moment that felt right. And when he came in from the south pasture and washed his hands at the kitchen basin and looked up and found her watching him with a particular expression, he went very still. "Dorothy," he said. "We are going to have a child," she said. Edwin dried his hands on the towel with careful attention, as though the towel required his full focus. Then he put the towel down and turned around, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it, a complex arrangement of things that included astonishment and something that was very plainly joy and something else that was more complicated and quieter, something that looked like gratitude. "When?" he said. "November, I think," Dorothy said. "The doctor in Millhaven should be able to confirm." "We will go to Millhaven this week," he said immediately. Then, after a pause, "Are you well? Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her with the careful certainty that characterized all his physical expressions of feeling, holding her in a way that managed to be both firm and gentle, the way you hold something you are both protective of and grateful for. "Edwin," she said against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Everything is exactly right," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "It is." The doctor in Millhaven, a competent man named Dr. Hayes, who had been practicing in this part of Texas since the early 1860s, confirmed Dorothy's estimate and told her she was in excellent health and should expect no complications, and that his fee would be $3 for the delivery when the time came. Edwin paid him immediately and asked 4 very specific questions about what Dorothy should and should not be doing, which Dr. Hayes answered with the appreciation of a man who was accustomed to husbands who did not ask anything at all. On the way back from Millhaven, Edwin said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," Dorothy said. "If it is a boy," he said, "I would like to call him James, after my grandfather." "James Underwood," Dorothy said, trying it. "Yes, what if it is a girl?" "I had not considered that equally," he admitted. "Then you should begin," Dorothy said. "Girls are equally possible." "Clara," he said after a moment, "my mother's name." "James or Clara," Dorothy said, "both are good names." "You do not want to use a family name of your own," Edwin said. "My family names are all right," Dorothy said diplomatically, "but none of them are as good as James or Clara." Edwin made the sound that was his version of laughter when something amused him in a specific way. Dorothy had spent months cataloging his small expressions of feeling because each one was precise and never wasted, and she treasured them in proportion to their rarity. The summer passed with the heat and work and color of a Texas summer, and Dorothy's pregnancy progressed without complication, and the Copperhead's cattle operation had its best quarter since Edwin had established it. Tamaz was given a raise and a share of the quarter's profit, which he received with the dignified gratitude that characterized his general interaction with the world. Casper Malone, the 25-year-old who had started the year enthusiastic beyond his skill, had by August become genuinely capable, and Edwin told him so in the direct way he told everyone accurate things about themselves. The secret between Dorothy and Edwin in this period was the growing awareness of how completely they had become essential to each other. A fact that neither of them stated directly, but that was visible in the way the household functioned. In the way a morning did not fully begin for either of them until they had exchanged the first words of the day over coffee. In the way Edwin came to find her when something happened on the ranch that needed her particular form of clear thinking. In the way she went to him when she was trying to understand something and needed the precision of his analysis. One evening in August, when the heat had not yet left but the light was doing something extraordinary with the flat horizon, Edwin found her sitting on the porch steps and sat down beside her without asking, and they watched the light change through its full range of color, from gold to orange to red to the deep blue that comes just before dark. And he took her hand in the same way he had taken it across the kitchen table during the November storm, without ceremony, without drama. Because she was there and he was glad she was there, and that was the whole of it. "Edwin," she said, "yes, I need you to know something." "All right," he said. "What I felt when I left," she said. "When I left the first time. It was not that I did not feel everything I felt. I was frightened of it. I had never," she stopped, "tried again. When you are accustomed to love being conditional," she said, "when you have had a father who could only love a diminished version of you and a man like Gerald Pratt who approached love as a transaction, then something real is terrifying. It looks like a trap." "I know," Edwin said. "I need you to know that it was not you I was running from," she said. "It was myself. I was running from the version of myself that wanted you and was afraid of wanting you." He was quiet for a moment. The horizon was deep red. "I know that too," he said. "I knew it when I read your letter. It is why I wrote back." "Just like that," she said. "No," he said, "not just like that. 3 weeks of that letter sitting on my table before I could write back. But yes, because the thing you described, the impulse to run from something real, I understood it. I did not run from Caroline, but I have. There are things I have been keeping at a distance for a long time. Feelings I considered impractical. You do not run from them with your feet. You run from them inside." Dorothy leaned against his shoulder. "We are a pair," she said. "We are," he agreed. "A well-matched pair, I think." "Edwin Underwood complimenting our compatibility," she said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said." "I said other things," he said with dignity. "In the letter, considerably more eloquent things." "You did," she said, "but this is real time and it counts differently." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You make everything worth doing," he said in his quiet and particular voice. "I want you to know that. The ranch, the account books, the fence repairs, the conversations with the doctor, all of it. You make it worth it." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the last of the red light. "That," she said, "is considerably more eloquent." He looked at her with a seriousness that was underlaid, she could see, with the feeling he was always most careful with. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, not briefly, with the thoroughness of a man who means what he is doing, and the horizon completed its passage from red to deep blue around them. James Edwin Underwood arrived on the 14th of November, 1877, at 7 in the morning, with Dr. Hayes in attendance, and Edwin in the kitchen doing something with his hands that he could not afterward identify, but that had probably involved a great deal of coffee and the systematic rearrangement of items that did not need rearranging. When Dr. Hayes came out and said the words "healthy boy," Edwin set down whatever he was holding and walked to the bedroom door and did not say anything for a full minute because he was not capable of saying anything, which Dorothy observed from the bed with the baby against her chest and thought, "There he is, there is the whole of him, all the things he keeps behind the guard, available to be seen." "Come here," she said. Edwin came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at James Edwin Underwood with an expression that would have been recognizable to any person who has ever looked at their own child for the first time, an expression that combines astonishment and love and the dawning understanding of an entirely new and permanent vulnerability, all at once. "He looks like you," Dorothy said. Edwin looked at her. "He has your nose," he said. "He has your chin," she said. "His eyes are your color," he said. "His hands are enormous," she said, "which is entirely your doing." Edwin looked at the baby's hands with the focused attention he brought to everything. The small fingers flexed and relaxed in whatever dream space a newborn inhabits. Then he looked at Dorothy and said, in a voice very different from his usual one, in the voice that came out only in the private moments they had built together, "Thank you. You did contribute to the project," Dorothy said. "Not for that," he said. "For coming. When I wrote, for boarding the train." Dorothy looked at him, this man who had written 3 pages when she had expected nothing, who had been at the station when she had half expected to find an empty platform, who had turned out to be everything the 10 days had promised and more. She looked at him with James against her chest and the November light coming through the east window and the permanent understanding that this, all of this, was the right place, the right person, the right life. "Thank you for writing," she said. He took her free hand and held it the way he always did, with careful certainty, and they were quiet together in the room that smelled of new life and wood smoke and November. And outside, on the Copperhead Ranch, the day was going about its business in the perfectly ordinary way that days do, indifferent to the fact that inside the house, something had been made whole. James was 6 months old when Dorothy found herself contemplating the particular quality of their life, with the kind of deliberate appreciation you bring to something you know is good and want to fully understand. She was at the kitchen table with the account books, James asleep in the wicker cradle that Edwin had spent 3 weeks building and that he had presented without comment, simply moved into the kitchen one morning as though it had always been there, which was how Edwin generally handled the things he had made carefully and was quietly proud of. She was thinking about the 2 years she had spent in Kansas City and St. Louis and Abilene, the seamstress work and the rented rooms and the weight of the guilt she had been carrying. And she was thinking about the moment she had read those 3 pages and understood that the thing she had been running from was still there, still waiting, still worth the risk. Edwin came in from the south pasture, and he was dusty and carrying his hat, and he looked at the cradle and then at Dorothy and said, "Everything all right?" "More than all right," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and came to stand beside her at the table, looking at the account books over her shoulder with the attention he always gave them. "The spring quarter is looking better than last year's," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking we might consider the additional pasture that Hector Rays has been offering to sell." "I had the same thought," Edwin said. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, opening the books to the relevant section. This was how they worked, this easy and collaborative method, the two of them moving around each other's thinking with the familiarity of people who have been doing it for a while and have found a rhythm that suits both of them. James woke up and made his opinion of being awake known, and Edwin reached into the cradle without looking up from the account books and settled the baby with one large, careful hand, a gesture so natural and unconscious that Dorothy stopped and stared at it until Edwin looked up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He held her gaze for a moment with that particular quality of attention. Then he turned back to the account books. "The Rays pasture," he said. "I think we should make an offer before the end of the month." "I agree," Dorothy said, and she returned to the numbers, and James settled back to sleep, and outside the May sun was doing everything a May sun in Texas should do, which is a great deal. They made the offer on the Rays pasture and it was accepted, and the expanded acreage made the spring of 1878 the most profitable season the Copperhead had seen. Edwin hired a second full-time hand, a steady man of 30 named Arvin Dale, who was a widower with a permanent squint from years of looking at the Texas sun, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person who made operations run smoothly without anyone needing to think about why. Dorothy began to teach herself Spanish from a book she had found in the Millhaven General Store, partly because she wanted to be able to communicate properly with Tomás, and partly because she had always found the language interesting and now had specific motivation. Tomás, when informed of this, offered to help her practice in the evenings after supper, and these sessions became a regular feature of the household, conducted at the kitchen table with Edwin occasionally contributing a word he knew, and then denying that he knew any more when pressed. "You understand more than you admit," Dorothy told him one evening. "I understand enough to know when someone is saying something I should know," Edwin said. "That is a functional definition of language acquisition," Dorothy said. "It serves my purposes," Edwin said. Tomas made a face that suggested he was keeping his opinion of this exchange to himself, which was wise. James, at 14 months, demonstrated his father's particular quality of focused attention and his mother's facility with words, a combination that manifested in an 18-month-old who could communicate his requirements with unsettling precision and who regarded the world with dark eyes that missed nothing. He also had, it became apparent early, a great deal of physical courage, an interest in climbing things that did not seem designed to be climbed, and a complete lack of the fear of heights that would have made this interest less of a concern. "He is going to be a problem," Edwin said, retrieving James from the second rail of the fence for the fourth time in one afternoon. "He is going to be interesting," Dorothy corrected. Edwin looked at her over the top of James's head, and the look contained both a contradiction and the acknowledgement that she was also right. In the spring of 1879, Dorothy became pregnant with their second child, and this pregnancy was different from the first in the particular way that second pregnancies are different, in that both parents were less terrified and more confident, and more able to appreciate the experience rather than spending it in a state of preparatory anxiety. The summer was a good one, the cattle operation running smoothly with Arvin's competent addition, the Ray's pasture proving its worth, James developing into a small and determined person who was beginning to form sentences of considerable complexity. Dorothy was 30 years old, and she had a thought one August evening, sitting on the same porch steps where she and Edwin had watched the horizon turn red, that she wanted to acknowledge the specific nature of this. She had been afraid at 28 of becoming something small and trapped. She had run from the right thing because she was so accustomed to the wrong things. And now she was 30, and she had an expanding ranch and a husband who wrote her 3 pages when she expected nothing, and who built cradles without comment, and who had, very slowly and very deliberately, learned to say the things he felt in addition to showing them. And she had a son who had his father's eyes and her own nose and the combined stubbornness of both of them. And she had a second child coming in December. And she had the account books and the growing Spanish vocabulary and the east-facing window in the room that had been the guest room and was now their room. She had the right things. Edwin sat down beside her, as he always did, without asking. He looked at the horizon. "You are thinking something," he said. "I am thinking about how things look different when you are where you are supposed to be," she said. "Meaning this is where you are supposed to be," he said. She looked at him. The light was doing the gold thing it did in the late afternoons of August, and it fell on his face in a way that showed the years and the weather and the work, and also showed the thing that was always there underneath, the person who wrote 5 pages and cut 2 of them because they were excessive, the person who meant every word he said. "Yes," she said, "this is exactly where I am supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have thought about the letter," he said. "Your letter, the one you sent from Abilene, I thought about it for 6 weeks while I was deciding whether to write back." "You said 3 weeks," Dorothy said. "I said it sat on the table for 3 weeks," Edwin said. "I thought about it for 6. I could not stop thinking about it even when I was ignoring it." He looked at the horizon. "The part that made me write back," he said. "It was not the explanation. The explanation I had already worked out most of myself. It was one sentence." "Which one?" Dorothy said softly. "You wrote," he said, his voice careful and precise as always. "I know I do not deserve the chance to say this to your face, but I am saying it to paper because I cannot keep it inside any longer. You were the most honest thing I ever encountered, and I am sorry I did not understand until too late that honesty is not the same as danger, and that I confused the two in a way that cost us both something real. Dorothy felt the words land in her chest. That sentence, Edwin said. That was the one, because it told me that you had understood something I had not been sure you understood, and it told me he stopped. He was working on it. She waited because she had learned that waiting was the right thing to do when he was working on something important. It told me, he said finally, that what I had thought I felt during those 10 days was real, that I had not imagined it, that it had existed and that it had mattered to you and that you had named it accurately. He looked at her. And if it had been real and it had mattered and you had named it, then I was not willing to leave it where it was. Dorothy's eyes were doing something she was trying to manage. Edwin. I wrote 5 pages, he said. I maintain that cutting 2 of them was the correct editorial decision. She laughed, and the tears that had been threatening resolved themselves into the laughter which was better and more characteristic of them as a pair. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The train was on time, she said after a moment. I know, he said. I was watching for it. You were very calm when you saw me, she said. I was not calm, he said. I was managing the not calm, which is different. You were very convincing, she said. Years of practice, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. That particular tone that was the voice equivalent of the expression she loved best on his face. They sat until the light had completed its full performance and the stars were starting their business, and James, who had been put to bed an hour ago and had apparently reconsidered this decision, appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt and regarded them with serious dark eyes. Cannot sleep, he announced. Edwin looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Edwin. This exchange contained a full conversation conducted in the language they had developed, which was mostly looks and small expressions, and the accumulated understanding of what the other person would say before they said it. Dorothy held out her arm and James came and inserted himself between them on the step, which resolved the problem of the nightshirt in the cold air. And they sat, the 3 of them, with the 4th in progress, on the porch of the Copperhead Ranch in the late summer of 1879. And the stars were very bright over the flat Texas land, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and the world was the particular size it becomes when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Clara Margaret Underwood arrived on the 15th of December, 1879, which was a very cold day, colder than Dr. Hayes considered ideal for the purpose, but Clara appeared to have no objections to the temperature, and arrived with a directness and an impatient quality that Dorothy recognized immediately and attributed to her father. Edwin, in the kitchen with James on his lap because James had refused to be anywhere else, received the news with the same expression he had produced at James's arrival, that complete and unguarded look, the whole of him visible for the moments when it mattered most. When Dorothy said, "Come and meet your daughter," and Edwin came and looked at Clara, he said, "She already looks annoyed," which was accurate, and which Dorothy took as a promising sign of character. James, at 2½ regarded his sister with the scientific seriousness of someone conducting an important evaluation. His verdict, after 3 minutes of careful study, was small, which was fair. "She will grow," Edwin told him. James considered this. "How much?" he said. "Considerably," Edwin said. James accepted this information and transferred his attention to his father's coat buttons, which he had always found interesting. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was a quieter winter than the previous years. Quiet in the sense that the ranch operations were stable, the family was healthy, and the account books showed a surplus that Edwin considered satisfactory and Dorothy considered encouraging. They made plans for a renovation of the main house, nothing extravagant, but a proper parlor room added to the east side that would serve as a family space separate from the kitchen, and a room for James as he grew older, and the small but significant luxury of better insulation in the existing walls, which had been a source of drafts since the house was built. The renovation was completed in the spring of 1880, and the parlor room became what Dorothy had imagined it would be. A room with books on 2 shelves and the comfortable chairs she had found in Millhaven and reupholstered herself, and a rug that Tamaz had brought back from a trip to see his family, and presented to the household with the air of a man who had thought carefully about a gift, and a writing desk in the corner that was ostensibly for general use, but that everyone understood to be Dorothy's. It was at this desk, one April evening with Clara asleep and James in bed and Edwin across the parlor with his account books and the history of the Civil War that he had been reading in segments for several years, that Dorothy sat down and took out a sheet of paper. She thought for a moment. She wrote, "Dear Mrs. Fenwick, who are you writing to?" Edwin said without looking up from the Civil War. "Mrs. Fenwick in Abilene," Dorothy said. "She lent me $2 for the train fare. I sent her the money back within 6 months, but I never properly thanked her." Edwin looked up from his book. He looked at her across the parlor with the evening lamp between them and his account books on his knee, and the particular quality of attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel both seen and safe, which she had decided long ago were the two things she had always most needed from a person. 3 years, he said. She deserved a proper thank you, Dorothy said. No, Edwin said. I meant that it has been almost 3 years since the day you walked into this house with your trunk. Dorothy set her pen down. She looked at him. She thought about the letter that had arrived on a Thursday morning, and the hands that would not stop shaking, and the moment of reading "I will wait," and believing it because she had learned in 10 days that Edwin Underwood meant what he said. She thought about the Thursday evening train, and the station in Abilene, and the night ride, and the morning arrival in Dodge City, and Edwin at the far end of the platform with his hat on, and his expression doing the thing it always did. 3 years, she said. You came on a Friday, he said, September the 23rd. I was at the station at 8 in the morning because I was uncertain when the train from Abilene would arrive and I did not want to miss it. You had been waiting since 8 in the morning, Dorothy said. The train arrived at 9:15, Edwin said. You never told me that, Dorothy said. You did not ask, he said. He looked at her with the look that contained the smile that was not always fully visible on his face but was always present in his eyes. I had been waiting for 6 weeks, he said. An hour and 15 minutes at the station was not the part that was difficult. Dorothy looked at this man, 35 years old now, the same dark eyes and the same precise manner of saying exactly what he meant, and not a word more, with the addition of 3 years of the specific kind of knowing that only comes from being genuinely and completely present with another person. She thought about forbidden and betrayal and dark past and trap and secrets, all the things that had been true of the situation they had arrived in through such a complicated route. And she thought about how all of those things had resolved, not by disappearing but by being spoken directly, which was Edwin's natural language, and which he had patiently waited for her to find her own way to. She thought about Mrs. Fenwick pressing $2 into her hand and saying life is too short for running from the things worth having. She thought about a Thursday morning and hands that would not stop shaking, and 3 pages of deliberate, careful handwriting pressed with the confidence of a man who meant what he said. She got up from the writing desk and crossed the parlor and sat in the chair beside Edwin's, which was where she sat when they read in the evenings, and he moved his account books to give her the armrest, which was also how evenings went, and she leaned against him the way she had learned to, easily and permanently, because this was where she fitted and they both knew it. Write Mrs. Fenwick a good letter, he said. I intend to, Dorothy said. Tell her the $2 were very well invested, he said. Dorothy looked up at him. He met her eyes with the full, unguarded expression she had come to know as the one he kept for her, the one that said everything he sometimes struggled to say in words, said it completely and without reservation. I will tell her exactly that, Dorothy said. She finished the letter to Mrs. Fenwick the following morning, 4 pages of proper gratitude and genuine news, and she mentioned the ranch and the 2 children and the account books and the parlor room and the east-facing window, and at the end she wrote, You told me life was too short for running from the things worth having. I took the train, and you were right. It was the single best decision I have ever made, second only to writing the letter that made the train necessary. Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick, for the $2 and for the wisdom, which was worth considerably more. She sealed it and gave it to Caspar Malone to post on his next trip to Millhaven. Mrs. Fenwick wrote back 6 weeks later, a brief and warm letter that said she was glad to hear it, and that she had suspected it would go well from the look on Dorothy's face, and that she had recently taken on a young woman assistant who reminded her somewhat of Dorothy and who, if there was any justice in the world, would find her own $2 worth of courage when the time came. Dorothy showed the letter to Edwin, who read it and said, "She sounds like a sensible woman." "She is an excellent woman," Dorothy said. "You should visit her someday," Edwin said. Dorothy looked at him. "You would come to Abilene." "I have never been to Abilene," Edwin said. "I expect it is not enormously different from any other Kansas cattle town, but I have no specific objection to going." "We could take the children," Dorothy said, and felt something like amusement at the idea of James and Clara on a train, which would be, she was fairly confident, an adventure for everyone in the car. "We could," Edwin said, "when Clara is a bit older." "She is 4 months old," Dorothy said. "Define a bit older." "Old enough that traveling with her is not a military operation," Edwin said. Dorothy conceded this was a reasonable standard. James, who had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of a child who understands more than adults generally credit, said, "Train," with considerable enthusiasm. "Not yet," Dorothy and Edwin said, simultaneously, which was another thing that happened with increasing frequency as the years went on, the converging of thought that comes from a genuine partnership. James accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a child who has learned that patience is a required quality in the Underwood household, which it was, and which he was, slowly and with many exceptions, developing. The autumn of 1880 brought a visit from Harriet and her husband, who had made a point of coming annually since the wedding, and whose visits Dorothy looked forward to with genuine warmth. Harriet, who had been a breathless and emotional presence at the ceremony, had in subsequent visits revealed herself to be a woman of considerable good sense beneath the surface dramatics, and she and Dorothy had settled into the kind of friendship that is more valuable than the kind built on long acquaintance, the kind built on genuine recognition. Harriet held Clara with the competent ease of a woman who had 2 of her own children and was hoping for more, and watched Edwin carry James on his shoulders through the dooryard while explaining something about the horses, and said to Dorothy, "He is not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" Dorothy said. "A harder man," Harriet said. "Not cold, not unkind, but armored, I suppose." Clarence said Edwin Underwood was the kind of man who kept his own counsel and didn't particularly invite anyone else's. "He does keep his own counsel," Dorothy said, "but the armor is not what it appears. He is," she considered the right word. "He is precise," she said finally. "He is very precise about everything, including what he feels and who he shows it to. It is not the same as being armored. It is the same as being careful with the things that matter." Harriet looked at her with the expression of someone who is receiving information she finds both interesting and correct. "You are very well suited," she said. "We are," Dorothy said. "I did not fully understand how well suited until I had been here long enough to see it clearly, but yes, we are." "And you came very close to not being here at all," Harriet said, which was very like Harriet, who was never quite as oblique as the situation demanded. "I know," Dorothy said. "It is something I am aware of more than occasionally." "The letter was what did it," Harriet said. "Clarence asked me what made you go. I said the letter. He said most men would not write a letter like that. I said most men are not Edwin Underwood." Dorothy looked across the dooryard at Edwin, who had deposited James on the top fence rail and was standing beside him with one hand steadying him, talking to him about something that had James's full attention, because Edwin's conversations about things he knew tended to have people's full attention. "No," Dorothy said. "They are not." By the time Dorothy was 32 and Clara was 2 years old and James was 5, and the ranch had completed 2 good years in a row, the Copperhead was a different operation than the one Dorothy had first seen, larger and more organized and running with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from all the parts knowing their function. Tamaz had become, in all practical terms, a foreman, though they did not use that title because it was not the nature of the operation to need titles, and Caspar Malone had become the kind of competent ranch hand who was reliably excellent without being remarkable, which was what you needed more than anything else in the day-to-day. Edwin's reputation in the area around Millhaven had evolved in the years since Dorothy's arrival in a way that she found privately satisfying. He had always been respected. He had always been known as a man of his word and a fair dealer. But there was something additional now, something that had to do with the specific kind of solidity that comes from a man who knows what he has and is not taking it for granted. People noticed it without being able to name it, which was the most genuine form of it. Dorothy was recognized in Millhaven in her own right, for the account-keeping and for the organizational contribution she made to the operation, and for the way she participated in the community in practical ways that did not seek attention, but that people noticed and were grateful for. She had helped establish a small lending library from the books she and Edwin had accumulated, housed in the general store, and this had become something the area had not known it needed until it had it. James had started the small school in Millhaven, which he attended with Arvindale's son and several other children from the surrounding ranches, and he was demonstrating there what Dorothy had observed at home, which was a mind that worked quickly and a competitive quality that needed direction, but was, at its root, a strength. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Applewhite who had come from Ohio and was clearly surprised by Texas but managing bravely, had told Dorothy that James was her most challenging student in the positive sense of that word, which Dorothy reported to Edwin, who said she should try living with him, which was not an actual complaint. Clara, at 2, was still in the phase of the world where everything is interesting and nothing is a limit, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's quickness with words and a personality that was both, which combined into something that was going to be magnificent and was currently a significant amount of work. Edwin, who had somehow become exactly as patient with Clara as James's climbing and fence rail activities had required him to be patient with James, had a specific expression he wore when Clara was in the middle of something that would not end well, which was the expression of a man who has accepted the inevitability of the situation and is managing it. Dorothy sometimes caught herself watching him with the children and feeling the specific emotion that has no exact name in English but which every parent recognizes, the feeling of looking at something that is both yours and beyond you, something you made but that is already its own thing in the world, and will continue to be its own thing long after you have run out of the ability to manage the situation. She had a version of this feeling when she watched Edwin with the children, and she had a different but related version of it when she thought about the specific sequence of events that had led to them being in the same room. A newspaper advertisement, and 4 months of letters in 10 days, and a terrible decision, and 2 years of guilt, and a letter sent on an impulse from a rented room above a seamstress shop in Abilene, Kansas, and 3 pages of answer and a Thursday train. The sequence seemed, in retrospect, both very fragile and very sturdy, the kind of thing that could easily have gone differently at any of its many decision points, and also the kind of thing that, once it arrived at its right configuration, held. The spring of 1882 brought 2 things: the best calf crop the Copperhead had produced, and Dorothy's discovery that she was pregnant again, which she announced on a Tuesday evening, with the directness she had completely adopted as her own mode of communication after 5 years in a household where directness was the primary language. "You're going to need the other room finished," she said, meaning the second additional room that had been in the renovation plans since the parlor was built, but that they had not gotten around to completing. Edwin looked up from his Civil War history, which he had finally finished and was now rereading with the appreciation of a man who understood the subject better on the second pass. "When?" he said. "August, I think," Dorothy said. He set the book down. He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly well," she said. "Better, in fact. I feel better than either of the previous times at this stage." "Good," he said. He picked the book back up and then put it down again. "Dorothy." "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, which was what he said she had learned when the feeling was too complete for more specific language. "You are very welcome," she said, which was what she said in return because she understood what he meant and because she meant it too. The room was finished by July, which left a month of margin which they used. The baby arrived in late August of 1882. Another boy, who was named Thomas William Underwood after Edwin's closest friend from his early ranching days. A man named William Thomas who had died of a fever in 1869, and who Edwin spoke of rarely, but with the specific quality of loss that means a person was genuinely important. Thomas was a different kind of baby from James and Clara, quieter and more observant, lying in his cradle with a focused attention to the world around him that reminded Dorothy, with a particular warmth, of his father's way of taking in information before acting on it. He had Dorothy's coloring, which on him looked striking, and Clara's curiosity, and he was, from the beginning, the kind of person who makes a room feel more settled by being in it. James, at 5, appointed himself the authority on what Thomas should be taught about the ranch, and Clara, at 2.5, was of the opinion that Thomas was primarily interesting as a subject of observation and occasional interaction, and Thomas himself seemed content to be observed while he went about the serious business of being a new person in the world. Edwin sat with Thomas one evening, Dorothy watching from the kitchen doorway, and he was talking to the baby in the low, specific voice he used with the children, explaining something about the ranch and its operations with complete seriousness, as though Thomas was a colleague being briefed, which was how Edwin had always talked to James and Clara, and which Dorothy considered one of the most quietly wonderful things about him. The assumption that children were capable of understanding serious things if serious things were explained to them clearly and without condescension. She stayed in the doorway for a long time. In the years that followed, the Copperhead Ranch became what it was always in the process of becoming, a place of specific and genuine character, the kind of place that bears the imprint of the people who built it and who continue to build it. James grew into a boy who was, as Dorothy had predicted and Edwin had anticipated, interesting in all the ways that were complicated, and then, gradually, in all the ways that were magnificent. Clara became precisely what the 2-year-old had promised, magnificent and considerable work, and then, as she approached 10, magnificent and considerably easier. Thomas proved his early promise and became, as he grew, the kind of person who resolved things without anyone quite noticing they were being resolved, a gift he had inherited from some combination of his parents that expressed itself in him as a distinct and wonderful quality. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that tested the ranch's resources in a serious way, the worst dry season in 10 years by local memory, and Dorothy and Edwin sat at the table with the account books and made the calculations and the decisions that needed making, and they made them together in the way they made everything, with all the information on the table and both of their minds applied to it. They reduced the herd by a strategic portion, drew on the surplus from the good years, extended Tomas's authority over the day-to-day operations so Edwin could focus on the longer-term planning, and came through the drought in the autumn of 1887 in a condition that was reduced but not broken, which Edwin considered the right outcome. "You are not upset," Dorothy observed, the evening after the final accounting of the drought year. "No," Edwin said. "A man who has what I have is not entitled to be upset by a difficult year." She looked at him. "I mean the ranch," he said, with a straight face that was his version of pretending he had not meant the exact opposite of what he said. "I know what you mean," Dorothy said, "and I agree." He looked at her across the account books and the lamp and all the years. "You always know what I mean," he said. "Mostly," she said. "You are occasionally impenetrable." "I prefer to call it precise," he said. "You would," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one she had first seen on the night of the November storm when she had surprised him with a laugh, and which she had spent years accumulating, treating each instance like the specific and deliberate gift it was. "Dorothy," he said. "Yes." "I was going to write you one page," he said, "when I finally decided to write. I was going to write one clear and direct page that said what needed to be said." "What happened to one page?" she said. "It turned out," he said, "that one page was not sufficient to say what needed to be said." "No," she agreed. "3 pages was." He nodded once, the decisive nod. "3 pages was exactly right," he said. She reached across the table and he took her hand. And outside the drought had broken and the land was beginning, in its slow and determined way, to come back to itself. And inside the house James and Clara and Thomas were asleep in their rooms, and the parlor was warm and quiet, and the account books would be reviewed again in the morning. And in the morning Edwin would be up before Dorothy as he always was, and there would be coffee on the stove, and the east window would be letting in the first light, and all of it was exactly what it was supposed to be. She had boarded the train on a Thursday, frightened and hopeful in equal measure, because a man she had not expected to answer had written 3 pages and meant every word of them. She had arrived in Dodge City on a Friday morning and found him waiting at the station, as he had said he would be, because he meant what he said, because he had always meant what he said, and because 3 pages was the most honest thing anyone had ever offered her, and she had been brave enough finally to accept it. This was how it had happened. This was the whole of it. And it was, as Edwin had once said in his precise and particular way, more than sufficient.